All right, we're recording, so Martin, take it away.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Welcome everyone to the 11:15 session of the Future of Work Summit, celebrating AI and data automation. Today's subject is, or the session subject is micro-targeting and target marketing, using data to build a better brand. I have three exciting guests today here in the local tech community. Brian Dennett, co-founder of Enable.ai, Stacy Griggs, President CEO of Toro, and Lee Dorsey, Senior VP and Director of Innovation at Doe Anderson. I'm going to let them tell more about themselves in a moment here. But some of the topics is going to be they're going to be a free-flowing discussion, mostly from these guys. I might chime in here and there to prompt a couple of thoughts. But keep this in mind as we get going. What is micro-targeting? I'll give you some dictionary definitions here. These guys are going to the nuances. Micro-targeting, a marketing strategy that capitalizes on the consumer's demographic, psychographic, geographic, and behavioral data to predict buying behavior. What is machine learning? Another facet of AI, a branch of artificial intelligence focused on building applications that learn from data and improve their accuracy over time without being programmed to do so. So that's the school book definition. We'll jump right in, though, with these guys. And, they may want to hit some of the historic comparisons, these different epochs of advancement, electricity being one of those. In our lifetime, the internet being one of those since the mid-90s. And today it's data. So we'll just jump right on in and maybe start, guys, with some of the topics here that you guys work on. I know, Stacy, you mentioned something about a Texas Roadhouse example. Lee and you mentioned something about Doe Anderson's project with Enable.ai. We talked about measurability and data validation. So you guys jump in and carry it wherever you like.
I can go ahead and start off. I mean, when you look at data and the ability to use data, the amount of data available for advertisers and data scientists has exploded in the last 5 years. I mean, if you think about, at El Toro, we've got a data store that is multiple petabytes of data. And, just, 5-6 years ago, big data stores were in the terabytes. We used to interview big data people, and when they talked about working with 20 gigs of data, that was a big data project. So the amount of data available to use and make decisions on has grown exponentially over, call it, the last half a decade, and that's led to advances in how to use that data that are frankly amazing. When you think about micro targeting, and I'll let a couple of the other panelists talk about Texas Roadhouse, but a good example we have is in the trucking industry. We have a major client that was comparing us to Google and Facebook and Bing for truck driver recruitment. And the thing is, if you think about the social media networks, they don't really know your occupation. They might know where you work, but getting deeper into that, like, are you a truck driver, and what sort of truck do you drive, and what sort of routes do you drive? But using geolocative data that people opt into, and then overlaying that with some advanced knowledge of those locations, like, are those truck stops? We're able to then very effectively identify a group of long-haul truck drivers and advertise to them. And when you then start looking at that, since you know who you're advertising to, did they take jobs with our clients? So instead of measuring things like clicks and click-through rate and cost per click, we're actually able to really peel back the onion and say, how much in recruitment dollars did they have to spend on marketing dollars per recruit? And those are the types of things that become extraordinarily valuable pieces of information for brands to start making decisions on a whole new set of metrics.
The theme of data exploding is definitely something that I think the business world has been experiencing for basically since the advent of the internet. I mean, it was, I want to say 2009 when I was working on master data systems for Colgate-Palmolive. And even back then, we were seeing the trend of, as a business, we were going to have to prepare for, what was going to be an avalanche of data. Like the pace at which data was coming in was ever increasing, and we have not seen it relent at all. And I think in the marketing space, the thing that is interesting is that much of that data is unstructured. And the fact that we now have this mountain of unstructured data is, I think, one of the reasons why we're seeing this rise of machine learning and AI, because they are the most effective tools we have right now for understanding all that unstructured data. And that is a big part of what we focus on at Enable.ai, is what we call data enrichment. And so essentially, if you have unstructured data, call it an image on social media, our goal is to understand what are the red threads in that content that may be indicative of why it performed well or why it underperformed or why it might resonate with a specific audience. And those are the kinds of data points that we look to collect to allow marketers to be more data-driven.
And that's the nature of our relationship with Enable.ai. And Martin, you referenced the Texas Roadhouse example. That's a fantastic example of how client side, agency side, tech partner come together to solve a very real problem, and a very real problem that's rooted in data and unstructured data, as Brian mentioned. What we've done in that partnership is to think about social media measurement and find a better solution, because I think we all know that likes, comments, and shares aren't the most indicative behaviors of real brand building and real business building kinds of behavior. And so what we've actually partnered with Enable.ai and Texas Roadhouse to do is to break down social measurement into the content and then into the comments. The content, we're using a lot of techniques that Brian can speak to far more eloquently than I can, to look at the specific creative decisions that we make when developing a post. What words do we use? What images do we use? What colors do we use? All of those minute decisions that at some point a creative has made to put out some kind of creative piece into the world. And then on the flip side, we look at the comments and we break down the nature of those comments into things like sentiment or topical analysis. And so when you pair those two things together, what it enables us to do is think about the specific creative levers that we can pull and what specific type of behavior we anticipate to get from our particular audience, and map how that evolves over time. What we are hypothesizing is that's a better form of measurement, a better bridge between online behavior and offline behavior, because we have found that a conversation, not only on Texas Roadhouse, but also some other clients where we've scaled this out, indicates very real business behavior. There are comments about going and buying Texas Roadhouse. They're tagging friends and talking about how amazing their experience was at Texas Roadhouse. We see trial, intent, and advocacy living and breathing within the comment section. And so we have a much more nuanced perspective of how our content can drive that kind of conversation, at what volume, and how that changes over time.
Lee's getting into something we talked a little bit about in the preparation for this, which is, not only has data exploded, but also how people are using data. If you go back, just 10 years ago, most, first of all, data wasn't even a science, and data science has exploded in the last 10 years. There were always scientists who use data. There were always analysts who use data. But what's happened is you've got this kind of the four levels of what we'll call analytics, descriptive analytics. What happened? Diagnostic analytics. Why did it happen? And 10 years ago, that's pretty much where analytics stopped. Over the last 10 years, you've also seen a huge push into things like predictive analytics. What will happen? And prescriptive analytics. How can we make it happen? And that's where you've got that nexus of big data and ML and AI, because often these decisions need to be made much quicker than humans can make them.
So, Stacy, I'm curious about that. Perhaps how is that, manifesting itself in the local market here for professionals who are trying to expand into that world? Because I know you guys are expanding your workforce in a variety of ways.
Yeah, so we've got over 100 staff here in Louisville. We've also got some remote staff, but I look at Louisville as a fantastic place to build a data economy. We've got low cost real estate, low cost of living. It's very livable. Paul Ford, who relocated here and has started a company called Traffic, has a great story, and Traffic is in the insurance space, but his story is actually about physical traffic of, when he lived in San Francisco, he spent an hour each way each day in traffic minimum. And, in the 6 years he's been in Louisville, he's been in traffic twice. So think about that quality of life that, you're taking 2 hours of your day that you're losing in the Bay Area to commute. And, if you told people they had to drive 15 minutes for something here, they would usually choose not to go, because everything is so commutable. And, all of that, has really, led to, the question we need to ask ourselves as a community is like, where are we in the digital economy? And there are a ton of really cool companies doing things with big data, AI, machine learning, and data science here in Louisville. And I'll let Brian and Lee talk about some of the stuff they're doing, but I think Louisville's a great place for this.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there's a ton of traction here, and I think the universities local to here are definitely focused in the right areas. I know that there's been multiple programs spun up around business analytics and machine learning, and so the whole ecosystem here, I think, is really seeing the trends and trying to get ahead of them. I mean, this entire conference is kind of in that spirit. And Doe, I can definitely let Lee speak to this more, but like Doe, I think, is a good example of a company locally that had the foresight to really try and jump on this, because when we were still whiteboarding ideas and Enable.ai was still literally a napkin sketch, we met with people at Doe, Lee included, and they saw the vision. They saw the way that we could apply machine learning to make a better data-driven marketing strategy. And they bought in and they worked with us, and we've done a lot of this kind of together as we work through the kinks and figure out where can this data actually be applied, where is it effective, where are there potentially gaps in what it can do, because machine learning is still not general intelligence. There are limitations, and sometimes it's surprising where you find them. But yeah, Doe had the vision to get ahead of it and get there early. And Lee's been busy building an innovation team over there. So, I mean, I can definitely hand it over to him to speak more on that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this event, as you mentioned, is a great example of what I think is best about Louisville and the opportunities ahead. We're open to collaborating. We're open to sharing technologies and ideas, because we all recognize that the best innovations happen when you can co-create and you can learn from people in different disciplines. And so that's been a key focus for us as an agency, is to help build that network in Louisville, but also participate actively in that network. And we talked about the Texas Roadhouse example before. I think this conversation is another great example. We're listening to Stacy speak. It's already inspiring me to think of a million ideas that I want to go talk to him about after this session. And hopefully the same thing happens to anyone sitting on this session. We continue to grow the capabilities. We continue to grow the talent pool that's available and the resources that are available in this market to make a real difference in the businesses that are here and the businesses that are changing the whole world.
Yeah, I like the point that all of you guys make about collaborating and networking, especially in this market, since it's a huge opportunity to expand that. And we were just briefly saying before we got started, imagine the great things we can do once life returns to the point that we can mix and mingle in person the way we used to pre-pandemic. So maybe talk about some of those ideas as well. How could some of our guests who are on here, who are startups and some in some form or fashion, might engage with you guys in that sort of way?
Well, I guess one thing that I can speak to, and I would be interested to hear Stacy's opinion on some of this, is when we think about data in marketing, there's two hard things. One is the life cycle of data. So how do you kind of keep data in the loop and think about operationalizing marketing so that there's repeatability in success? Because if you think about marketing, it's a creative pursuit. It's kind of, inspirationally driven. There's a bit of a flash in the pan kind of nature to it. And so figuring out how to repeat success is tricky. And then the other side of it is really trying to strike that balance between data and creativity, because if you get too predictive, if you get too prescriptive, you run the risk of becoming monotone, because the nature of the way machine learning systems work, they'll arrive at the best answer based on historic data, and then they'll continue driving you towards that destination, that points. And you, as the human operator, as the creative, really needs to take a step back and think, am I reaching a local maxima? Is this enough? Am I saturating this kind of creative or this kind of tactic? And figuring out how to strike the balance there, I think, is still something that is very much greenfield and something that we think about a lot when we think about how we're deploying solutions.
Yeah, and Brian, I mean, you're spot on, if machines could do it all, then it's kind of the end of an era for like people in ad agencies and tech companies and those types of things. And this really very much is a combination of both art and science. And we talk a lot about the science, but there is a very applicable art that needs to be focused on here. When I look at kind of, I heard the question a little bit differently of like, as a community, like what do we do and how do we work with each other and those types of things. First of all, like if you're not using big data and ML and AI today, you probably should for just about any sort of business. Second, if you're thinking about starting a business, this is a great place to start a business locally. And you might say, well, gosh, I don't have any data science skills. Well, there are tons of programs where you can go to a Code Louisville or Microsoft Future of Work or the University of Louisville MSBA program. Like pick your program. Interact has training programs that are fantastic. Pick your program and get some skills and training, and this is a space where like all three of the companies on here are probably pretty aggressive in hiring people and to come in and help build our teams and help build our product sets, but also help our customers become more effective in understanding their customers and how to market to them.
I think we also share a responsibility to destigmatize data and AI. I think it's a very intimidating field to many. And I think that intimidation factor prevents many from taking the first step and from taking it from this generic concept that only a few people have the expertise to do into something that we all should have a baseline understanding of and find very real applications. I mean, Brian always talks about how AI is this generic nebulous term, and underneath it, there are so many different facets. And it's until you uncover those very specific applications, it feels inaccessible. It feels too futuristic. And I think a lot of businesses are beginning to see the very simple steps that can be taken, destigmatizing the practice of data and not relegating it to just the data scientist or just to the few who have the more sophisticated skills, when in reality, modern day business, everyone should have some level of these skills.
Now that's a great segue, Lee, and you can go ahead, Stacy. It seems like you were getting ready to say something, but I'd also like you guys to jump into more detail about the Texas Roadhouse example, because that's a lot of people's favorite restaurant. We all like to eat. If there's anything the public's ready to do more is to go out to their favorite restaurant in a while. So either Lee or Brian and Stacy can, after Stacy gets his turn here.
Yeah, I'll let Lee and Brian talk about Texas Roadhouse. We do some other work for Texas Roadhouse, but I was going to jump in on what Lee was saying, that there's a democratization of data and data science that's happening right now, where literally anybody can do it. And the other thing is, like, occasionally I will talk to people, and sometimes people at church, sometimes people in my family, and you mention artificial intelligence, and they immediately think that like what we're doing is going to cause the Terminator, and I'm pretty sure, like 100% sure, that what we're doing at El Toro isn't going to lead to like a Terminator or like sentient event and like the computer networks, when you talked about stigmatization of data science, there's and AI, there's also that stigma of like people that have only seen iRobot and Terminator movies and those types of things, that's what they're thinking about when you talk about artificial intelligence. Not like, how do we make better and quicker decisions on what products to market to people and how to communicate to them and those types of things.
And in the creative industry, we run into this question about whether we're replacing people and creativity. And the reality is, no, it's supplemental. We use the data to inform that creativity, to inspire that creativity. They are one and the same, yin and yang, not competing with one another.
Yeah, before we move on from this subject, I think one thing that's worth saying is that the idea of getting involved in the data economy or getting involved in the machine learning AI space, I think that there's a misconception that you need to be an engineer, that you need to be able to develop machine learning systems to be involved. I think that the ability to apply these systems, to understand where their strengths and weaknesses are, is just as important, if not more so, than being able to develop and deploy these solutions. And the idea of developing an intuition for data, for developing some data savviness, I think that ends up being an area that a lot of people can move into and embrace and not feel intimidated, not feel like this is super technical. If you think about machine learning as just the new digital transformation, if you think about, like, when we applied computers to the business world, that was a huge shift. And now we're applying machine learning to the business world, and it's another huge shift. But a lot of it is more a question of process engineering. It is a question of rethinking how you develop strategy, what check-in points, what data you utilize. There's more data available now, but a lot of the underlying soft skills are still just as relevant. And so just thinking about, how do I refine these soft skills so that I can now incorporate all this new data and all these new techniques, like that, I think is the sweet spot for the average person.
Cool. And there's a comment here in the chat that, and I'll just read it out. Training current employees who are interested in big data is a great retention strategy as well. So I think that leads towards your point as well, Brian. Then they can serve as an expert in big data and more invested in their company. So yeah, internal career transition seems to be a great opportunity as well.
And I'll do the segue into the Texas Roadhouse thing now. So on this same subject, if we at Enable.ai are machine learning developers, like we build models, we develop systems, we develop analytics on top of it. Doe, Anderson, and Lee has been along for the ride as the operators of it. We have kind of gone with them step by step, and as we understand the problem space and as we understand the data that we can develop for it, we've basically gone to them and said, hey, you're the marketing subject matter experts. You have a sense of how to build strategy. Let us help inform that in a new and more innovative way. And that's essentially what they did with Texas Roadhouse. And so we did this whole historic analysis of what's going on there. What's the Texas Roadhouse audience like? What's the Texas Roadhouse content and brand strategy like? And how can we start to deconstruct that to identify what really shines and what doesn't? And Lee can kind of take it and run from there.
One really early and interesting insight that came from that historical analysis is the power of roles. And if you look at the Texas Roadhouse feeds, first off, follow it if you're not already, would love your support. But second, you'll notice that when there are posts that have roles, the engagement explodes, and it's very positive engagement. And so what we had to do with that information is, how much do you use roles to your advantage? Do you pair roles with a promo message, and does that help elevate the conversation around a more business building behavior? Or do you save your roles just for role-based posts, and do you overdo it? And if you overdo it and every post becomes about roles, is your feed no longer interesting, and now you're just a page that's all about roles and not actually about an overall restaurant experience? And I think that's a really good example of the creativity plus the science, and how you can't have AI or data drive you too finely towards an end, because if you do that, you won't experiment, you won't find better solutions than what historical data would point you toward, and you also are going to run stale as the environment around your decisions changes. One really specific campaign that came out of our work with Texas Roadhouse is something that we called Roadhouse in the House. And as you can imagine, the pandemic had quite the impact on the restaurant industry. Texas Roadhouse was certainly not immune to that. Closing the in-person dining experience was tough. It was tough because that's where a lot of the experience lived. And we understood from our historical work in social really how powerful the components of the in-person experience really were. It wasn't just food, it wasn't just value, it was an ambiance, it was the sound, it was the smell, it was the saddle that you ride for your birthday. And so that spawned this idea that we needed to support our community when they were dining at home, ideally carry out from Texas Roadhouse, but we needed to support them with the overall experience that they had come to learn and love of Texas Roadhouse. And so Roadhouse in the House was a multi-sensory, multi-touch point campaign that attempted to mimic and in many ways extend the in-person experience. We did things like take the jukebox that's in the restaurants and turn it into a Spotify playlist. We took the coloring sheets that you would generally give to children in the restaurant and posted them on a dedicated group for families to entertain children at dinner. We created 360 video of the restaurant so you could immerse. We created AR filters that let you put a cowboy hat on and ride the saddle as if you were in the restaurant, but you could do it at home. And it was a great way of continuing what is core to Texas Roadhouse in a way that we couldn't connect because we didn't have the in-person experience. And it really helped to support the carry-out sales and support the families eating at home during a time when the business needed it most and at a time when consumers needed it most as well. Hopefully that was specific enough on the case study. I'm sure we could go more into it if you'd like, but
Yeah, that was a great example of, have to pardon the lawn work going on outside the door here in a very timely fashion. That was a great example of a range of technologies. Guys, AR, VR, you transition traditional music into what everybody carries on their phone or plays in their system. So that's a really great example of the classic COVID pivot, as we're talking about, most things and so many industries. I'm curious to know, you guys may have covered this, but what was the impetus for Doe and Enable.ai to come together and in the first place? How long have you guys been working together?
You want to start with your back napkin?
I'll let you tell the story.
So Brian approached us, about 2 years ago now? Maybe 3. Time certainly flies and we've been busy.
Yeah.
And it was very early in their process of identifying what niche they really wanted to fill. And ultimately they wanted to ask, what's on our mind as an agency? What are the concerns we have? What are the possible use cases? And it was a little bit serendipitous. We were at Muscle and Burger Bar downtown, and I had just gotten out of a meeting. We were looking into social listening tools. And social listening tools, if you're not familiar, takes a lot of the social publicly available data, uses natural language processing and categorizes it into themes, and you can measure the volume. And so it's a really good insight tool. And so I had just spent 6 months really digging into it. And we as a team really dug into it to decide what we wanted to do there. And when Brian approached, we saw an opportunity to take the same technologies that were driving and techniques that were driving social listening, but apply them into a very different problem space. And that problem space was the measurement of social media performance, not necessarily the insight generation from publicly available data. And that led to a lot of conversations, just dreaming up what that really would look like as a product, what that would really look like for Enable.ai as a business, what that would look like in terms of a partnership with us. And then we had the great fortune of finding Texas Roadhouse as a really good partner to actually pilot it on it. And, like I say, fortunate because not every client is open to experimenting with these things. And so they gave us the trust and the latitude to apply our ideas. And we've been able to show those results quickly. So that relationship continues to grow and we continue to scale that approach and that philosophy of social media content and social media management into all of our clients.
One thing that I'll kind of jump on with this is, we when we were starting this, we went through this process of customer discovery, and so we had a couple ideas in terms of directions we'd go in, because machine learning is a general purpose technology, and marketing is awash in data, in unstructured data, and so we had hunches on what we wanted to do with it. But as we kind of went through that process with Doe and with Texas Roadhouse, we've really refined where there are opportunities for value add, and I think that is kind of just an interesting pattern in the machine learning space, where there is opportunity to say, hey, there is a mountain of data somewhere. What are the different ways that you can take that data and turn it into a new value proposition? And finding customers, clients, partners that are willing to kind of go down that path with you and figure out how to disrupt and how to innovate and how to leverage new data and new technologies is a surprisingly hard thing. It takes a certain level of bravery on behalf of all the participants in those projects to say, hey, I've got my tried and true things and they work well enough. I'm keeping pace with my competitors, so on and so forth. But really being able to blaze a new trail is something that I think is a little bit tricky to do. And I would love to see the marketing space in particular become more open to embracing new technologies. And I'd love to, I'm sure Stacy has a bunch of war stories about going down that path and convincing people to use new techniques and technologies.
I was actually going to say that, so Brian and his partner Eric they went on, what I would call a 3-6 month listening session where they did customer discovery with, obviously the folks at Doe, the folks at Texas Roadhouse, with us. They went out and talked to everybody they could and said, tell me what problems you're experiencing, and let's talk about how tools could potentially solve those problems, or AI and ML tools could solve those problems. And it is a recipe for success for a startup to do that, because the more inputs and the more you understand your targeted industry, the more successful you're going to be. And then you're also going to eventually meet some people that have the right kind of problem, that the pain point's there and there isn't somebody out solving that pain point, and it helps you kind of form your strategy. I see a lot of people that make the mistake of saying, hey, I want to do this. Why do you want to do that? Has anyone agreed to pay you to do that? Which should be like one of the first questions any entrepreneur asks. But it's one of those scenarios that you need to, it's like I always thought that these guys were going to be successful based off of just like the level of learning and knowledge that they were kind of out acquiring in the kind of beginning start of the part of the business. And like, that's how you there's all kinds of adoption issues with new technologies across a broad range of things. The other thing that I see common among especially local entrepreneurs is, local entrepreneurs often limit their sales pipeline to local companies. And the thing is, you might have a product that's wildly popular, but you're trying to sell it to the wrong 5 companies. And so you need to find that product company match. When I moved back here, it was for a company called Maximum ASP, and Maximum had done kind of the opposite of what most companies had done. They sold online. So I did some analysis and I said, by the way, at this point, 1 month in, I'm like, we have more customers in Afghanistan than we have in Louisville. And I said, so, I actually, told the entire team, I said, I'm going to put you on a little bit of a different course, which is, I want you to start talking to your neighbors and your friends and people you go to church with about what you do. Because if people know what you do, some of them will buy from us. And because we shouldn't have more customers in Afghanistan than we did in Louisville. And by the time we left, by the time we sold the company, we probably had 15-20% of our revenue from Louisville. But there's always a mix of where's that product market fit, and trying to convince people to try something they maybe haven't tried before, whether it's a product or a company that provides that product.
In the innovation space, we often talk about adoption curves and hype cycles, and different companies are at different points in their understanding and their comfort level with data. We've talked a lot about kind of that early stage, but I think that we're also starting to see stage 2, which in hype cycle language is the trough of disillusionment. It's the most bizarre language. It's very illustrative. But the concept is there's a lot of data, there's a lot of excitement around it. There's AI, there's a lot of excitement around it, and the potential drives hype. And so everyone wants to go pursue it because of the appeal. Then what tends to happen is the realities hit. There are certain limitations. It's not always sunshine and rainbows. And that's where you get this significant decline in the interest and the comfort level with it, because you're seeing some of the dark side of what data you can collect, the integrity of the data, the ethical implications of AI, and they steer away from it hard. And then what tends to happen is it comes back up and it settles right where it probably should settle, with a realistic application of the technology, a realistic comfort level of where to put it. And so I only mention that because we see that with our clients every day that we talk to them, that they're at a different stage. They want to do all digital marketing, all digital advertising, because it's going to be the most pointed solution to the problem. Then they get in there and they realize, uh-oh, is this all real traffic, or it's not giving me the ROI that I expected, or I'm not actually tracking it all the way to a sale because my sale can't happen in an e-commerce setting. And then they pull the money back and they want to go put it somewhere else. And we're starting again to see it settle out where it probably should as a distribution of an overall marketing budget.
And we have another question in the chat here that I think's apropos. Have any of you used AI in business-to-business marketing? For example, account-based marketing.
So Stacy probably has a better answer for this. For us, the answer is effectively no. We've definitely looked into the B2B space. I do think that there's opportunities there. We've talked to a couple companies that have shown some interest there. But one thing that's true of machine learning is oftentimes if the data isn't there, it's hard to arrive at a good solution. And B2B marketing in particular is just by nature of the way it gets marketed, by nature of the pool of customers it's trying to target, it just tends to be a smaller data set. That's not always true. Like if you're getting into the analysis of paid media or the analysis of email marketing, things of that sort, I do think that there are rich data sets out there, but a prerequisite to be able to do machine learning well is oftentimes that you have a critical mass of data. Stacy operates in a slightly different area of the marketing space, and so he definitely has the luxury, at least I would think, of really having rich data sets where he can deploy things in a B2B setting. So I'll let him speak to that.
We do a fair amount of B2B. I mean, our core products are classically more B2C, but we do a fair amount of B2B. And I would say what we do in the B2B space is definitely more data science versus AI. We definitely it's analyst led to kind of figure out who to target, how to target them, those types of things, and then we apply a little bit of AI on like the ad serving and optimization side of things. But within to kind of unpack it a little bit, one of the things we'll do in the B2B space is it really does matter what sort of role someone is in. So think about, and when people say ABM, they're not thinking pharmaceutical companies, but we can identify groups of doctors by specialty based off of geolocative behavior. So if Pfizer had a drug that they wanted to advertise to allergists and their staffs, we can identify who allergists and their staffs are and then advertise that drug. So it becomes either an augment to or potential replacement of some of the money that they're spending on like pharmaceutical reps to go out and do the same type of thing.
I would say the vast majority of our B2B applications of data or AI are falling in that ad serving targeting space. One slight exception to that is when we will sometimes use AI to build a sales tool for your sales fleet when going to talk with a particular customer. So we've done some work with Carrier, HVAC manufacturer, Carrier Corporation, and they collect a lot of data through your thermostat on the functioning of your particular system, when it's working well, when it's not working well. They're using that data to predict failures before they happen, so you have a proactive sales approach. And so that helps dealers in a 3-tier distribution to engage the customers directly, the homeowners, to better service that equipment, but it also helps the OEM develop a better relationship with the dealers because they own that data and they own that resource for the dealer network. So I think it's a good example of how you can use AI not just from a marketing perspective to target people, but also to build a marketing tool or a sales tool that creates more stickiness across your customer base.
Yeah, one thing that we've been playing more with recently is the notion of product reviews. Product listings, I think provide an interesting data set into the psychology of the end consumer. And as we've started to collect and develop data sets from that space, I think we've seen opportunities where, hey, we're seeing insights that could be useful to a retailer, to a distributor, to restaurant chains. Like there's opportunity, I think, in the ML space to get a little bit clever about what data sets you think of as relevant and what insights you can potentially get out of them to apply to tangential areas. And so while we're not really going all in on that kind of solution at this point, it is something that we see as a long-term strategy for us to think about B2C type data sets and then figure out how to repurpose them into B2B settings.
Well, and it was interesting, the kind of the mention of carrier and thermostats, but you look at what Virtual Peaker and Bill Burke are doing here in Louisville. They've built a virtual thermostat that is centrally controlled and uses some we'll call it AI to then as power capacity starts to shoot up, it will set your thermostat so that you use a little bit less power, so that what happens is you don't have to spin up dirty coal fire plants and those types of things to kind of use to hit that peak level of electric production. It's a really interesting, because as soon as you said carrier, I'm like, oh yeah, what's like the folks at Virtual Peaker are using the data produced by thermostats, and then also providing their own thermostat so that they can provide a very sustainable and green product using data.
It opens up entirely new value propositions that didn't exist before, because you can help a homeowner now regulate energy, not just heat and cool their home. And there are examples of that across all industries when applying data and collecting data, that those that do it best turn it into some new benefit to the consumer. Otherwise, the consumer's not likely to give you that data or be happy that you're collecting it. And as data privacy laws only continue to tighten up, that's going to be all the more important that you think about data from that perspective. How can I use this to improve the overall customer experience? How can I use this data to create entirely new value propositions that previously were inaccessible because we were looking at our product as a tangible thing, not an ecosystem of activities that solve some broader consumer need, problem, whatever it may be.
Yeah, I mean, the term that I think I've already used it, but this notion of operationalizing marketing, of thinking about the process engineering side of it. I mean, the nature of business in general is that landscapes shift over time. This focus on being more green with your electric consumption is a more recent shift. And so there's shifts in terms of consumer psychology, there's shifts in terms of competitive landscapes in marketing messaging, and the real value add of operationalizing marketing is that you start to create an organization that has the wherewithal to identify when these shifts are occurring, is collecting the right data to identify the potential ramifications of these shifts, and then lets you get ahead of how to adjust accordingly to right size your business to the new consumer need, to right size your marketing tactics for the way that channels are now operating or the way that new platforms want you to present yourself. There's a level of flexibility that I think is required in business in general. And the better you get at data, the more flexibility you offer yourself.
There's some really cool examples that are starting to emerge in the marketing space of using these different AI techniques and using data to actually drive the campaign idea. One example of that is Theraflu in Mexico. They created a predictive model of when the flu was going to peak in different regions of Mexico. They then created a whole campaign that was targeted and timed based on the threat level of a given area. And obviously you could see how that would play its way out. They would change their messaging from, hey, are you aware of Theraflu, to, hey, threat level in your area is high. You might want to think about going and stocking up because you'll be safer in that way. A couple of other examples that I've seen where AI is the core of the creative idea is Ballantines. It's a scotch. They did a campaign in Spain, I believe, that is starting to roll out across multiple markets, where they brought people in and created a hologram version of themselves based on the social data that was available on them. So they created essentially a character around their social presence, and they sat them at a bar together and they had a conversation. You, the person, and you, your online persona. And the whole point was that your self-perception is different than what you project, and Ballantine Scotch, fits into there from a brand perspective. Or in Australia, 2016, they had a whole campaign to stop bullying, where they created a tool that edited the language as you were typing if it had any kind of an insult or negative language. Just put a red line in it. And they rolled that out in a campaign to try and get children to be more aware of the language they use. And that was a nice nudge to reword the language that they had into something that was more positive, or at least to be aware that they were making that decision for themselves.
So you mentioned when you guys mentioned right sizing marketing strategies and what have you. Is that something that's becoming a trend, or are clients resistant to that, one of those things, or that one of the things that they fear? How does the right sizing scenario look in various ways?
I think to a large extent, as long as you've got data and I would call it authenticity with the client. Because sometimes we'll go to clients and say, you know what, you should spend less. Or you should stop doing this, or that might seem counter to and certainly I guess it's counter to short-term business interest, but it's actually extraordinarily beneficial to long-term business interest to tell a client, no, I don't love what you're doing right now. In fact, I begged one of our resellers back about a year ago to not do a campaign for a client, and I'm like, look, this campaign will not work. And I'm like, I'm putting it in writing to you so that you understand that I don't believe this will be an effective campaign at all. And he goes, well, but they could spend all this money. I'm like, they're not going to spend any more money than this because it's not going to work. So he's like, and then it came back to, well, I already told him we would do it. I'm like, well, you should go back to them and tell them you were mistaken. Because the reality is, clients like that authenticity, and in some cases, I'm telling them don't spend money or spend less money, and in some cases we're telling them no, we found a mine of gold here, we should mine the gold. But it's the data that kind of backs that up, and then it's do you have a history of even if the results don't necessarily support your thesis, kind of being truthful with the client. We do a bunch of work with one of the 3 largest auto manufacturers in the world. And we had this data set that we gave them, and every month looked really good except for October. And so we gave them all of the raw data, their data science team, our data science team. We're going through the process, and at one point, their lead data scientist said to us, he's like, look, no matter how this works out, you guys have been one of the best teams to work with, because you didn't argue that the data has to be wrong or make up excuses. You're like, we don't know, and why don't we give you all the data as well, and why don't we peel it back and figure it out together? And and at one point he ended up telling his boss, he's like, I wish every one of our providers were like this. He's like, I don't know how well you like them, but I like them a lot, because it is, here's the data, and let's figure out what happened in this 1 month that was anomalous data, and let's chase it down as much as we can.
Yeah, I think that is a theme that as you become more attuned, more focused to the data side of problems, is you just have to learn to embrace what is traditionally labeled as a failure, because failures are insightful in and of themselves, right? There's insight to be learned from that. There's patterns to be learned from that. And that's just part of your data set. If you ignore failures, if you try and gloss over failures, you're giving yourself an incomplete picture of the problem space. And one of the things that we've kind of had to go through as a growing pain was early on, we were very focused on content and social engagements, and not every brand has a lot of social engagement. And so in terms of performance metrics, there's not necessarily a whole lot that we can do for them. But as time has gone on, we've learned to grow the aperture. And so where it started with just social content, now, we can ask questions around different kinds of content. We can get into product reviews. We can start to analyze competitors. And so maybe you don't have a lot of engagement, but someone else does. And so like the notion of failure for us doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot, other than it's just an interesting facet of the data set. If you, the brand, failed, or if one of your competitors failed, or if one of your products failed, like that's all rich data for us to build a more comprehensive picture of what's going on in your market, in your vertical, with your customer. And I think that is a slight shift in psychology that a lot of people are still probably in the process of arriving at.
Those are both great points. It sort of makes me think of a very specific example that we're currently navigating, and that's that there is a predominant theory in marketing circles right now about long-term brand building and short-term sales activation. Two different kinds of approaches, two different kinds of tactics that you have to employ to build a brand. The metaphor that we often use for that is it's like planting a crop. Brand building is actually planting the seeds and watering it, and then sales activation is when you actually reap the harvest. If you don't plant enough, you don't build enough brand equity, you don't have enough to go pluck when it comes time to harvest. If you overplant and don't actually pluck enough, you've now got a ton of wastage. And so we build different tactics, and in terms of measurement, it has to be different kinds of measurement to evaluate effectiveness. And we find that a lot of our particular clients want immediate returns, short-term sales activation, and yet we need to recommend a higher percentage going towards brand building kind of behavior. And so we're having to supplement our data sets with some of those brand building longer term metrics to paint a better financial picture, even if it's not a sale directly attributed to a click on a particular ad.
Yeah, there's a whole conversation that's been going on for a while in the marketing space around CX, the customer experience. And one of the bigger takeaways there, I think, is that every moment of interaction, every paid ad, every ad spots, every word of mouth conversation, every time someone purchases, those are all part of the customer experience, and they all do something to your brand in the minds of that consumer, whether they're a current customer or potential future customer. And that's one thing that has always been hard in marketing, is how do you really start to build out an attribution model to understand what all those touch points do. And that's something that we are actively trying to think through. And we've done a decent job at taking some data sets and laddering up some of those insights into what does this mean for the brand? How does that implicate the brand? How can you build a healthier, more robust brand over time? But I think that this is going to be a long-term pursuit of machine learning and marketing, is how do you start to stitch together all these different data sets to get a more comprehensive attribution model around what are the implications of any given marketing activity on your long-term brand equity, whether it's paid media, whether it's social media, whether it's events, like all of that traditional media. Like there's opportunity for something approaching a unified model. And I think that that's one of the more exciting things to think about pursuing in the marketing space over the next decade.
So as we approach the end of our session here, guys, this has been really great. All the great examples of value of collaboration, machine learning, and AI, and how you work with your partners in different ways. What are a final one or two thoughts from each of you that you think would be valuable takeaways for the session's participants?
The thing that I'll say, and we use this term a lot when we're talking to clients, is I think it's more productive to not think about machine learning as AI, as artificial intelligence, but instead to think about machine learning as intelligence augmentation. These are a new breed of tools to empower you, the user, you, the business user, to do your job more effectively, to have a more comprehensive view of the world. And if you think about everything machine learning as a way to supplement what you already do, I think that starts to really open up your purview of the different ways that you can leverage this technology and all the data out there to be a more effective business.
I'll jump in, Stacy. We're doing that kind of back and forth hedging. I think it's our responsibility as leaders, particularly in a market that is increasingly reliant and dependent on data, to create spaces and foster spaces where inquiry leads to insight and insight leads to impact. We have to ask the right questions, and that's the starting point. That points you to the data, that points you to different data sets, that points you to different ways of collecting data, but at the end of the day, it starts with asking the right questions and relentlessly continuing to ask those questions. Then when you get to the insight phase, how do you distill all that information? Do you have the right people to take all of that overload and distill it to the thing that's going to actually impact business and that you can actually socialize across the organization to get to the final piece of it, which is impact? None of this matters if we sit in a room and talk about really cool questions and answer those, but it never gets socialized across the organization. The right insights aren't shared with the right people. We don't have the confidence to go pursue whatever insight is there. And if you get all three of those things right, it's a virtuous loop that will only continue to feed itself and grow, because the more success you have, the more impact you have, the more questions you'll have, the more insights you'll generate, and you'll build a culture where data is a tool that fuels this. But at the end of the day, it's not about data for data's sake. It's about asking the right questions to build your business more effectively.
So I got three things. One is, first of all, Martin, thank you for being the moderator here and kind of moving us along, keep us on track, asking great questions.
Absolutely.
Second, and Lee just mentioned distilling data, and it really kind of rang a bell with me thinking about kind of Louisville and distillation. We're in the information economy, and we have all of this data, and companies are drowning in data, and they're starving for information. And that, portion in the middle is the problem that like all three of our companies are solving. But Louisville is ideally suited to be, kind of that distiller of data into information, just like we're a distiller of corn and rye and water into delicious bourbon and other whiskeys. And the third thing is, you know what? If you swing for the fences, you're going to fail sometimes. So dream big, do big things, but think about Major League Baseball. A really good hitter is going to get 600 at bats a year. A really good hitter is going to hit about 300 home runs in a year. So that means about 0.5% of the time they're hitting a home run. So if you're swinging for home runs, you're going to have some failures, and learn from those failures, but don't stop playing the game, because there's another at bat coming up.
Great insights, guys. I appreciate it again. Sarah, would you like to chime in at this point? Appreciate you guys for participating with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you guys so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this session. We are going to have everyone now go to futurelou.com, and I'll add that into the chat for everyone to go to our next session. Thank you so much, Lee, Brian, Stacy, and Martin for moderating today. And we'll continue this rest of the day session with Future Lou. So thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.